My parents said gaming was worthless and destroyed my setup. Now I make $2 million a year streaming. I was 17 when my father took a sledgehammer to my custom-built gaming rig that had taken me 2 years to save for and assemble. The sound of the graphics card shattering echoed through our garage while my mother held my arms behind my back to prevent me from interfering. They'd found out I'd been skipping football practice to compete in online tournaments, earning small prize money that I'd been hiding in a separate bank account. "This garbage ends today," my father said, swinging the hammer down on my mechanical keyboard with enough force to send keys flying across the concrete floor. "You're going to college on a football scholarship like we planned, not wasting your life on children's games." My custom lighting setup sparked and died as he destroyed each component methodically, professionally, like he was demolishing a condemned building. What they didn't understand was that I'd been earning more money in weekend tournaments than most adults made in part-time jobs. My streaming setup had started attracting sponsors, and 3 different esports teams had reached out about potential contracts. But my parents saw only the hours I spent staring at screens, instead of throwing footballs or studying business management like they'd planned for my future. The destruction of my equipment wasn't just about the money I'd lost, or the months of work that disappeared in 20 minutes. It was about my parents' complete inability to see that I'd found something I was genuinely talented at, something that could provide a real career path if they'd given me the chance to pursue it seriously. My father was a successful contractor who'd built his business from nothing, and he expected me to follow a traditional path toward financial security. College football scholarship, business degree, corporate job, suburban house, traditional family. The idea that someone could make a living playing video games was so foreign to him that he'd rather destroy everything than acknowledge the possibility. My mother worked as a nurse and had sacrificed her own dreams to support his business in the early years. She'd internalized his belief that success required suffering and traditional hard work, that anything that looked like fun couldn't be legitimate career preparation. They'd both grown up poor and couldn't conceive of a world where entertainment and financial success intersected. After the destruction, they installed parental controls on our home internet and monitored my every movement to ensure I couldn't rebuild my setup or continue competing online. They signed me up for additional football camps and academic tutoring to fill every hour I'd previously spent gaming, creating a schedule that left no time for the activities they considered worthless. But I'd been part of the gaming community long enough to know that my skills and reputation couldn't be destroyed as easily as hardware. The relationships I'd built with other players, streamers, and industry contacts existed independently of my physical setup, and several people reached out when I disappeared from competitions without explanation. A player named Kai Nakamura, who'd become something like a mentor through our online interactions, noticed my sudden absence from tournaments and tracked down my social media accounts. When I explained what had happened, he offered to help me find ways to continue practicing and competing despite my parents' restrictions. Kai was 19 and already making 6 figures annually through streaming and tournament winnings. He'd faced similar family opposition in Japan before moving to Los Angeles to pursue gaming professionally. His success story was exactly what I needed to hear, proof that the career path my parents dismissed as fantasy was not only possible, but profitable for people with the right skills and dedication. He connected me with other players who'd dealt with family opposition, and together we developed strategies for maintaining competitive skills even with limited access to equipment. I practiced at the local library during lunch breaks, used computers in the school's media lab during study periods, and found ways to stay connected to the community that had become my primary source of identity and purpose. The restriction period lasted 6 months, during which my football performance actually declined because my heart wasn't in it anymore. My coaches noticed the change, but attributed it to typical teenage attitude problems, rather than recognizing that I was being forced to abandon something I was passionate about in favor of something that felt like obligation. My grades suffered as well, not because I was incapable of academic work, but because I was spending so much mental energy fighting against the path my parents had chosen for me. The business classes they'd insisted I take felt meaningless when I knew I had talents and interests that pointed in completely different directions. During this period, I started planning my escape more carefully than I'd ever planned anything in my life. I researched scholarship opportunities, alternative funding sources, and pathways to independence that wouldn't require my parents' financial support or approval. The gaming industry was growing rapidly, and there were opportunities they couldn't even imagine. On my 18th birthday, I received access to the bank account where I'd been depositing tournament winnings, which had grown to nearly $8,000 over 2 years of competition. My parents had known about the account, but couldn't access it without my permission, and they'd assumed the small amounts I'd mentioned represented occasional lucky breaks rather than consistent income. I used that money to rent a small apartment near the community college campus and bought basic equipment that would allow me to start streaming and competing again. My parents were furious when they discovered I'd moved out, but legally there was nothing they could do to force me back home or control my choices anymore. The first few months of independence were financially terrifying. I was paying rent, utilities, and expenses on tournament winnings that weren't guaranteed, and I had to rebuild my audience and reputation after 6 months of forced absence from the scene. Several sponsors had moved on to other players, and the competitive landscape had shifted in ways that required me to relearn strategies and adapt to new metas. But Kai had connected me with a small streaming collective that helped new creators build audiences and develop professional skills. They provided mentorship, technical support, and networking opportunities that would have taken me years to find on my own. Within 3 months, my streaming revenue was covering my basic expenses, and tournament winnings were providing additional income for equipment upgrades and savings. My parents responded to my success with a mixture of disbelief and anger. They couldn't reconcile their beliefs about work and value with the reality that I was supporting myself through activities they'd tried to eliminate from my life. My father suggested I was involved in something illegal or morally questionable, unable to accept that gaming had become a legitimate industry. The breakthrough came during my second year of independence, when I placed third in a major international tournament with a prize pool of $2 million. My share was $300,000, more money than my father made in most years of construction work. The tournament was live-streamed to over 1 million viewers, and gaming media covered the results extensively. Suddenly, my parents' friends and co-workers were asking about their son, the professional gamer, having seen coverage of the tournament in mainstream media. The narrative had shifted from concerned parents protecting their child from delusion to successful parents whose son had found an unconventional but profitable career path. My streaming audience grew exponentially following the tournament's success, and major sponsors started reaching out with endorsement deals and partnership opportunities. Within 6 months, my monthly income had increased to levels that made my parents' objections seem not just wrong, but financially irresponsible. They'd tried to prevent me from pursuing the most lucrative career I was capable of. The first time my father admitted he'd been wrong was during a phone call where he asked if I needed help managing my finances now that I was earning serious money. The conversation was awkward and strained, with him trying to position himself as helpful, rather than acknowledging the damage his opposition had caused to our relationship and my early career development. My mother's apology came later and felt more genuine, focused on recognizing that she'd failed to support my talents and interests rather than trying to reinsert herself into my success. She admitted that her fear of unconventional careers had been based on her own limitations rather than realistic assessment of my potential or the opportunities available in gaming. But their attempts at reconciliation felt calculated and conditional, based on my financial success, rather than genuine recognition that they'd been wrong to destroy my equipment and try to force me into a different path. If I'd failed at gaming and ended up struggling financially, they would have seen their destructive intervention as justified, rather than recognizing it as wrong, regardless of outcomes. The gaming industry continued evolving rapidly, with streaming platforms offering exclusive contracts and traditional media companies investing in esports content. My audience grew to over 2 million followers across multiple platforms, and my revenue streams diversified beyond tournaments and sponsorships into merchandise, content creation, and business partnerships. By age 22, I was earning more annually than both my parents combined, had purchased a house twice the size of the one I'd grown up in, and was regularly featured in business media as an example of successful entrepreneurship in emerging industries. The equipment they'd destroyed with a sledgehammer had been replaced by a professional streaming setup worth more than most people's cars. The validation felt satisfying, but it was complicated by the recognition that their opposition had actually motivated me to work harder and become more independent than I might have otherwise. Their attempt to destroy my career had inadvertently taught me resilience, financial planning, and self-reliance that served me well as an entrepreneur in a volatile industry. When gaming media started covering my backstory, including my parents' initial opposition and the destruction of my equipment, the response from the community was overwhelmingly supportive. Thousands of messages came from young gamers dealing with similar family conflicts, and I realized that my experience represented broader tensions between traditional career expectations and emerging opportunities. I started using my platform to advocate for young people pursuing unconventional careers, partnering with organizations that provided resources for aspiring content creators and professional gamers. The work felt meaningful in ways that went beyond personal success, addressing systemic problems I'd experienced firsthand and helping others avoid similar conflicts with family and society. My parents eventually became supportive, even proud of my career, but the relationship remained strained by their initial reaction and the years of conflict it had created. They attended industry events where I was speaking or receiving awards, trying to position themselves as supportive parents who'd always believed in my potential, rather than acknowledging the destructive impact of their opposition. The irony wasn't lost on me that they now bragged about my success to friends and co-workers, using my achievements to enhance their own social status, while rarely acknowledging the harm they'd caused by trying to prevent those same achievements. They wanted credit for raising a successful son without taking responsibility for nearly derailing his career through misguided intervention. 5 years after they destroyed my gaming setup, I was invited to speak at a business conference about entrepreneurship in digital media. My parents attended, sitting in the front row while I discussed overcoming family opposition and finding success in industries that older generations don't understand or value. During the Q&A period, someone asked about advice for parents whose children wanted to pursue careers in gaming or content creation. I looked directly at my parents while answering, explaining that the most important thing was to research and understand emerging industries rather than dismissing them based on outdated assumptions about work and value. Support your children's talents and interests, I said, even when they don't match your expectations or experiences. The economy is changing rapidly, and traditional career paths aren't always the safest or most profitable options anymore. Sometimes the things that look like play are actually the most serious business opportunities available. After the conference, my father approached me privately and offered what felt like his first genuine apology. He admitted that his opposition had been based on fear and ignorance rather than legitimate concern for my welfare, and that he regretted the damage it had caused to our relationship and my early career development. But even his apology was qualified by statements about how he couldn't have predicted gaming would become so profitable, as if the morality of destroying my equipment and trying to control my career depended on financial outcomes rather than respect for my autonomy and judgment. The most satisfying moment came 2 years later, when I was featured on the cover of a major business magazine as one of the top young entrepreneurs in digital media. The article detailed my income, business ventures, and influence in the gaming industry, including quotes from executives at major corporations who described me as a key figure in their marketing and content strategies. My parents framed the magazine cover and displayed it prominently in their living room, finally able to understand my success in terms they could explain to their peers. But seeing it there felt hollow rather than validating, a reminder that their support had always been conditional on social acceptability rather than genuine belief in my potential. The gaming industry continued expanding into mainstream entertainment and business, with professional players earning salaries comparable to traditional athletes and content creators, building media empires that rivaled established entertainment companies. What my parents had dismissed as worthless children's games had become a multi-billion-dollar industry that employed millions of people worldwide. At 25, I sold my streaming business and content library to a major media company for $42 million, transitioning into venture capital and angel investing focused on gaming and digital media startups. The kid whose parents had destroyed his computer setup was now funding the next generation of entrepreneurs in the industry they'd tried to prevent me from entering. Looking back, I understood that my parents' opposition had come from genuine concern for my welfare, but filtered through their own limitations and fears rather than realistic assessment of opportunities and risks. They'd tried to protect me from what they perceived as instability and uncertainty by forcing me toward what they saw as safety and respectability. But their definition of safety had been based on their own experiences rather than evolving economic realities, and their attempt to impose traditional career expectations had nearly cost me the opportunity to build something extraordinary in an emerging field where my talents and interests aligned perfectly with market demand. The destruction of my gaming setup had been intended as a decisive intervention to redirect my life toward conventional success. Instead, it had taught me independence, resilience, and the importance of pursuing opportunities that others don't yet understand or value. My career became a case study in recognizing and developing talent in industries that challenge traditional assumptions about work and worth. 7 years after taking a sledgehammer to my computer, my father attended the opening of my investment firm's new offices in downtown Los Angeles. He stood in the lobby surrounded by portraits of successful entrepreneurs I'd funded, finally understanding that the career he'd tried to destroy had become the foundation for building and supporting an entire ecosystem of digital innovation and creativity.